We've got a question here. Why are there differences in the resurrection accounts between the Gospels?
That's a good question, and I think there's a couple of theories about this that are possible. One would be that the Gospel writers use different sources, and I've already mentioned that as one of the ways that we test for historical reliability. For example, Matthew used the Gospel of Mark in writing his own Gospel. Mark was one of the sources Matthew used. But that's not the only source Matthew had, because he also relates the story of the guard at the tomb, right? And that's not found in Mark. It, moreover, wasn't made up by Matthew because he's clearly reacting or responding to the Jewish allegation that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. So he's responding to Jewish anti-Christian propaganda in telling this story. So here Matthew is working with a different source. Similarly, Luke has another source besides Mark, because he tells the story that was read this morning about how Peter went to the tomb to verify the women's report, and that's not found in Mark. Now, Luke didn't make that up. How do we know that? Because there's another independent source, namely John, who also tells the same story of how Peter, accompanied by the beloved disciple, went to the tomb to verify the women's report. So, if we have these multiple independent sources, then it is to be expected that they will tell the story somewhat differently. But what you have in every case is the same historical core. Namely, on the first day of the week, a number of women who were followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, she's always mentioned by name, went to the tomb very early and found it empty. That's the historical core. However differently these stories may be in their secondary details. Now, the other possible theory for these differences would be that in oral tradition, what is important is handing on the core of the story, but you can embellish or tell differently the secondary circumstantial details. And so what you would have in the Gospels would be different oral retellings of the story. And I have a wonderful illustration of this. When I was in seminary as a student, one of my professors told a joke. He said, "Did you hear about the Calvinist who fell down the elevator shaft?" And you say, "No." And he says, "Well, he got up, dusted himself off, and said, 'Phew, I'm glad that's over.'" Now, unless you know theology, you may not get the joke. 20 years later, someone else said to me, "Did you hear about the Calvinist who fell down the stairs?" And immediately I saw what was going on. I said, "No, what happened?" And this person said, "He got up and said, 'Whew, am I glad that's over.'" Now, notice how it was told differently. He didn't fall down the elevator shaft. He fell down the stairs in the second story. But the core, the punchline, "Whew, I'm glad that's over," that was identical. And that's the way oral tradition works. There is a central core that has to be gotten right in the retelling, but then the secondary details can differ. And this may be the explanation behind the differences in the Gospels.
Can I put to you a thought and get your comment on it?
All right.
Am I right in understanding you're saying that at the very least you can go to the Gospels and find the core is so much attested in so many eyewitness accounts, solid, clear. Some of the variety of whether there were how many women mentioned and so on, you're saying it's not the core, and so there might be various explanations for that.
Right.
Is that effectively what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, cool, got it. Because I would want to go on to say that the oral tradition didn't go very long.
You mean that the Gospels were written very early?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, for example, Mark is using a source for the story of Jesus' passion, the final week of Jesus' suffering and death. And this pre-Markan passion source that Mark used is very ancient and goes right back to the earliest disciples, and is probably based on eyewitness testimony. So I agree with you that these traditions very quickly got written down. But we, nevertheless, in a Jewish culture in which the ability to memorize and faithfully transmit large tracts of oral tradition an art which is lost in our culture, was a highly prized and highly developed skill.
Which we don't understand quite.
Right,
much,
right.